What it do, what it do. This is the Brothers on Books podcast where we find great books that will give you real value and actionable steps and have fun in the process. Please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations or if you would like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to this would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. I am Jack Allweil, and with me is my brother, Alex Allweil, in Nashville, Tennessee. Al, how you doing?
Doing great. How are you?
Doing a lot better now that Arsenal finally won the North London Derby, for like the first time in like 2 years, I think.
I was going to say that must have been quite the hiatus they had from, I guess, dominance over Tottenham. But every dog has his day, or as they so the saying goes.
Mm-hmm. I will say Tottenham did probably have the goal of the season. I don't know if you saw it, but
I did see it, and the first time I saw it, I didn't even think anything of it. And then when they zoomed in and I saw what he did, I was like, okay, that was pretty nice.
Yeah, it was pretty nice. And also, we are recording this on March 14th, so I should also wish you a happy Pi Day.
Yes. Very, very important. Going back to your math roots.
Yes. So today we have a real doozy, I would say. This was a book, and I guess this goes to show how this podcast is going to pay dividends, but this is a book I would have never read had you not drafted it or picked it. So what are we reading today, Al, or discussing?
Today we are reading a book called Darwin's Black Box, written by Dr. Michael J. Behe. So Dr. Behe was born in 1952. He completed his undergraduate work at Drexel University in 1974 with a BS in chemistry. He then proceeded to obtain his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in studying DNA, I believe DNA replication. He then did a postdoc at the NIH, and he took a couple of small-term professorships, and he's currently a professor of biochemistry at Lehigh. Sort of nice to do a formal academic intro for once.
There you go.
So I guess a couple. This was an interesting book, I have to say. This was recommended to me by actually someone I played pickleball with, that he was trying to do, or that he had done in one of his book clubs, but it just sort of happened to coincide with, I think, Christmas, so no one showed up to it. And he told me about it, and the way he described it was Professor Behe was he has a PhD in biochemistry. And he told me that he didn't believe in evolution. And I said, man, that is like sacrosanct in academics. I'm like, I got to read this book to see what he's saying. And, so here we are. So I guess, as we're starting, Jack, dude, before reading this, did you believe in evolution?
So before reading, I guess when we say evolution, we mean the process whereby life arose from non-living matter and subsequently developed entirely by natural means is the definition I have here. So I would say I did believe in evolution through natural selection, but I also would say that I did always question, well, where did that first matter come from? So I guess I would say I did, and I guess it's a different question, but I would say I did believe in God, and I do. So I guess that's where I started from. But I did believe in gradual progression, because that's kind of what we were taught, and that's kind of what I've taken as just assumed fact at this point. Did you believe in evolution before we read this book?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I did, and I would say I still do. So I think it's important to note some differences here. So there's, I mean, you can call it whatever you want to call it, but there is a difference. Sort of his argument stems from a difference between what he determines to be a micro and a macro evolution. At least that's how I would put it in my own words. So microevolutions would be the example whenever anyone asks me, or whenever anyone tries to say that evolution does not exist, the first thing I always say is go look up bacterial resistance to penicillin. So penicillin was discovered, I believe, in the early 30s by Alexander Fleming. And I think probably by the end of World War II, the initial penicillin was almost, to my knowledge, totally useless. And, you know, sort of what happens is that the active ingredient in penicillin is something called a beta-lactam. Just not to, I promise I won't get like super technical.
This was not in the book, just to be clear.
This was not in the book. This is just how
this is
whenever
your expertise.
Well, I wouldn't really say it's my expertise. I think this is pretty common knowledge. This is just always what I always fall back on, because I think it's the easiest to see, because bacteria sort of, I guess, propagate, or bacteria split so much. You can see, I guess, generations much quicker than you can say in like humans, which take, you know, I would say probably on average a minimum of like 25 years to have offspring. So what happened is, you know, and it totally goes by like sort of what Darwin said, is that penicillin has this functional group called a beta-lactam. A beta-lactam destroys the enzyme that makes bacterial cell walls. So all the bacteria couldn't make a cell wall, so they would die. So some bacteria had an enzyme called a beta-lactamase, which is an enzyme that just destroys beta-lactams. So those bacteria that have this specific enzyme, a beta-lactamase, would survive. Everything else would die. So after, you know, however many generations of bacteria, what you're left with is bacteria that only have beta-lactamases. So then the penicillin becomes essentially useless, and you have to sort of make a new drug, or you have to modify the penicillin. And we currently see that in today's standards. I mean, this is going, I don't think it's quite a problem yet. There are a couple antibiotics of like last resort that are still effective, but I don't know. Have you heard of MRSA?
No, I haven't heard of that. But I guess I'm doing a double take actually. Evolution, his definition. Actually, by his definition, I would say I did not believe in evolution before.
By Behe's definition, or
yeah, because it's actually saying I think I kind of was mixing up natural selection and evolution. So I guess I believed in natural selection. This evolution definition says a process whereby life arose from non-living matter. Well, I don't.
Yeah. So
and developed entirely by natural means.
So I guess I would also say, in the beginning of the book, I sort of thought he was going to say that, and which he did, which was that like Darwin's theory of natural selection and evolution could not explain how life arose from, I guess, non-living matter. And I think I would agree with that. The origin of life stuff, I think we'll get into it probably throughout this. The origin of life stuff is very, I would say, complicated and not well studied. So, right. So the bacteria, that would be an example of like microevolutions, right? And sort of what he's saying is that, you know, how can you explain macroevolutions? And those would be essentially evolutions that he makes the argument for, where you're developing entirely new like molecular biology systems.
Mhm.
And he's saying that those systems cannot really be gradually made step by step. So that's
Mhm.
sort of the argument. So historically, I would say people look at evolution from what's called a phenotype. So the actual physical appearance. So if you actually go back to Darwin's Origin of Species, he's talking about the finch's beaks.
Mhm.
So that is a phenotype. Like you can see the finch's beaks, and that's how he made his theories off of. So Dr. Behe is arguing off of a genotype sort of a genotype argument,
Framework.
like
Yeah.
right.
But
He's saying like,
but Darwin didn't have the genotype stuff to really fall.
right, yeah,
I
it
mean,
was
he
just
could
it
it
was
wasn't around then.
it wouldn't have been possible for him to know, and that's sort
Right.
of his point. Like we've gone to
Yeah.
this level. This is like the last level of science, like how complex cells actually are. Um, so yeah, so it's sort of a different frame. I think it is much easier to see really the phenotypes than the genotypes, because honestly, I mean, this book was written in '96, I believe, and almost 25 years later, I think a lot of what he's talking about is probably still, probably still not really well understood. It
Mhm.
seems like the more we go into, biology, the more complex things become.
Yeah. We're getting into the black box.
So I guess with that said, that brings us to our first ad of the day. We have pickleball, the greatest sport you've never heard of. Pickleball is the fastest growing leisure sport in the United States. It is a mix between tennis and table tennis. However, don't let the average age of the participant in this sport fool you. The game has a fierce competition, and only the will of a champion can thrive. Go buy some paddles and balls and play pickleball, the greatest sport you've never heard of. So actually, I have I have another sort of funny tangent. As I was just sort of perusing on Facebook this morning, someone on one of my Nashville pickleball groups posted this article about this guy wrote a sort of an op-ed in I guess the local Tennessean, which is like a local Nashville paper, and he's like
Mhm.
pickleball. When I heard about it, it was supposed to be a sport for old people that weren't athletic, had no coordination, and didn't really have to move. And I decided I'd go try it out.
Mhm.
And he wrote this starting essentially since the same time I started, in around May or June of 2020, so right during quarantine, for the exact same reason, as a a means to go have a socially distant activity that is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I guess for all of our listeners, we got two tournaments coming up. We got our Easter Day tournament in Knoxville, and then our Memorial Day tournament in Atlanta.
There we go.
So I got to ask, Jack, have you been practicing?
No. No, daylight saving time just started last night, so hopefully the extra sunlight will help me. But I mean, last time I played was 2 weeks ago. But the empty court we were playing at, where we were taking this portable net, they just put up their tennis courts or their tennis nets. So I don't know if we're gonna be able to play there now.
Okay.
Yeah.
We gotta do better than we did in our last tournament, which was a bronze. So
Okay.
I have faith in us.
Okay.
Okay. So with that said, I guess you want to start getting into it.
Yeah. I mean, what part do you want to start with? I think the most basic, or the fundamental thing that he talks about is this idea of an irreducibly complex system, I guess. And by that he means it's a system where if any part was removed, the whole system would crash, or it wouldn't be able to function in the manner it was meant to. And he keeps going back to this concept of a mouse trap, in the sense that if you took any component out of that mouse trap, the mousetrap would not function, would not be able to kill a mouse or trap a mouse. So yeah, I guess I'll
Yeah, so he then sort of goes, and he makes sort of some, I guess, humorous examples to like kind of Looney Tunes.
mhm.
But then he talks about, he sort of starts picking up all of these, what he refers to as irreducibly complex systems in cells. And his argument stems from the fact that, how could you gradually, how by gradual natural selection with gradual mutations in the cell could you arrive at these systems? I think that's
Basically because he sees that there are like, certain proteins or certain, I guess, parts of the cell that have a very specific function, and they either depend on some other part doing some function, and then protein A does something, and then protein B takes that and does something else, and it's just a lot of dependencies. And yeah, he's trying to say, like, if you take any one of those proteins or little soldiers out of the cell, that the whole function breaks down.
Yeah, and I mean that's fair. I actually, it's sort of weird, like, as he was bringing up all these components, I was trying to, in my head, explain how it could have happened. And, I am not an evolutionary biologist by any means. And yeah, I mean, I guess I personally, for most of them, couldn't do it. The one that I was probably, he talked about these bombardier beetles.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Yeah,
Where
go ahead.
they're mixing, essentially hydroquinone and like hydrogen peroxide, and that makes like some type of hot solution that it can then spew out of a hole at invaders. And that was kind of the closest I could come to. And maybe
yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And maybe thinking of how that could have come about. But
he did.
No, what were we going to say?
I was going to say, I mean, he did also bring up the kind of viewpoint that, okay, well, maybe they didn't, maybe these changes didn't occur gradually. Maybe they did occur suddenly. And then he brought a couple of people that had posed theories on how this might have occurred. And there was one, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this name right, Lynn Margulis, who kind of was about the advancement by cooperation and symbiosis, where like you have like these organisms like joining forces and aiding each other. And she kind of talked about like parts of the cells might have been once free living organisms. And she pointed out like mitochondria are roughly the size of bacteria cells. And the idea was that large cells might ingest these small bacteria, but they don't ingest it. And then I guess there's some mutual benefit, like the small cell provides some energy to the larger cell and zibby. But at the end of the day, the author still kind of countered that with like, it still begs the question of, where did those original cells come from? And
yeah,
then, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, with Lynn Margulis, he was pointing out the fact that at first she was the first person that is now considered to be the common belief, is that mitochondria used to be separate cell or separate bacteria that were ingested and then used. But when she initially proposed that, she was sort of laughed at. And I think he was kind of trying to say that just like he's being sort of laughed at by his theories, that at some point people will just kind of accept them. But yeah, I mean, I was, I guess just for transparency's sake, I have read some stuff that some of his arguments were not well, like fact checked.
You're talking the author of this book?
Yeah, if you go read the Wikipedia, people people on the Wikipedia, like some of the quoted authors he has from the book, are saying that it was not peer reviewed well, something along those lines. I mean, I think for the sake of this podcast, anything he says as a fact, I am just going to assume that is correct. I would say I agreed with a lot of his criticism of evolutionary biology. I thought were agree with, like when he was bringing up, how could you no one has shown like step by step how you go from point A to essentially point B. It's just, sort of conjecture, and they wave all these words around. But no, he is right. No one has shown how the cells have evolved. And I guess I don't know. I guess I have some thoughts on that.
He was saying there's like been nothing written, right? I mean, there's really like very little.
Essentially, nothing.
There's
published.
Nothing really. Yeah.
So he also made I guess we can circle back to that in a second. The thing that I actually really did agree with, he talks about these sequence homologies.
What do you mean by that?
So what people will do, or what scientists will do, is you sequence a genome, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you were sequence a human genome and like a chimpanzee genome.
Okay.
And you'll see that, I don't know the exact percentage, but like 95% of our genomes are the same.
Mm-hmm.
And then you sequence like a human genome and like a gorilla genome, and 90% of those sequences are the same. And then it's like a human genome and like an ape genome, and that's like 85%. So I had never thought about this, but I think he is right. Like, so what they are then saying is that you can say that humans and chimps essentially diverged in like the evolutionary tree, the nearest to present day time. So it would be like we had the shortest time period away common ancestor. So like going back, I guess you could say like humans, and I think for this example I used apes was like 85%. We branched off from apes farthest along. So we are the most different from apes. But he then points out that that's fine, but that doesn't really explain.
Yeah, that
right.
kind of just backs natural selection. That doesn't back design or evolution.
It doesn't back how evolution. The things sort of came to be.
Right.
I had never, because when you're like, I don't read a lot of these papers, but I have read some of them, you just sort of are like, yeah, okay, sure. Humans and chimps were together like 20 million years ago, and humans and, gorillas were like 40 million years ago. And it's just kind of like, yeah, whatever. But I think that is a valid criticism. I guess what I would say is, on some of the reasons why, I don't think a lot of examples are of that, is I guess I would say it's for twofold. And I'll just sort of put this in a personal context. I work in a field that's called like total synthesis. So we take compounds found in nature and we try and make them. So in the 60s and 70s, essentially, if you just wanted to write a paper, write a grant to the government to say you're going to try and make something cool for the sake of making something cool in a chemistry lab, you could get money to fund it. Today, if you're going to write the same grant, you essentially need to show that almost in every case, whatever you're trying to make has some type of biological target, and almost in every circumstance, just the like go-to is that it can be used as a cancer drug. And my point is that the government, which is usually funding all of this basic science, wants sort of applicable, research being done. And I guess sort of, for one, I don't think I don't think really you could get a grant to study this stuff. I don't think anyone could write to the government
I
and
was
say, what are you saying, Jack?
I was saying I was kind of thinking that because it's kind of on one hand, like even if you discovered it, like in terms of making money off it, like it's kind of like who cares?
Yeah, it has no use
Yeah.
other than you can. I mean, there is a use for just basic science. Like there is something to be said for the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, but you can't really do anything with it. And then the other thing I was going to say is it's very possible a lot of these there's no way to know, right? Like you can envision like some step in this sequence that is just totally gone. Like maybe you like sidestepped in the evolutionary pathway, maybe you sidestepped and went to some like sort of random, you had some random, mutation that sort of helped the organism. And then it just sort of went away, like after another mutation. And I guess sort of that wasn't explained very well. I guess what I mean is imagine you have some organism and you have a protein that does function A, and it does function A sort of in a crude way. You could then have some type of other, sort of like what you were saying, symbiotic relationship where another protein comes into existence and it helps, protein A do function A. And at first, they're sort of advantageous to each other. But then over time, let's say the original protein becomes totally useless and just protein B is totally doing everything on its own. And protein A essentially disappears through mutation because it's no longer useful. How would you ever know that protein existed in the first part?
I don't. I mean, you wouldn't.
Right. Yeah, that's my point. You wouldn't know. Like, so a lot of this, where a lot of his criticisms of the field.
But I guess he's also. But if you had those two proteins, by his definition, that would not be irreducibly complex, though, right?
Right, but
because you don't need both of them.
Well, okay, so in the beginning, you would need both of them. This is obviously a hypothetical situation that I'm making up.
But I thought you said like protein A was able to do whatever it was meant to do. It just wasn't as good as with protein B.
Right. So so you have protein A and protein B now, right? And it becomes better.
Okay.
And then over time, imagine that protein B can just do everything on its own, and protein A is sort of it's no longer useful to the cell to have protein A. It's just sort of superfluous. So then you only have protein B. So how would you ever be able to know that protein B exists or protein A existed?
I guess you wouldn't, but I guess you also could say that I guess we don't really. Do we really care about its existence?
Right. I would say that's fair. I'm just bringing up a point of what he's like criticizing the field for, of how no one has sort of mapped out these step-by-step mutations to get to these systems.
He did. Speaking of the people in the labs, he was saying there were guys that were trying to, mix. I think it was like hydrogen, nitrogen, like things that they hypothesized would have been the early stage gases, and then they shoot some electricity through to simulate lightning to get some, I guess, amino acids that were formed or something.
That's a little so that's like actually how they're proposing life starts.
Right, right.
I'm just, we can get there in a second. I'm just sort of talking about of his like argument of irreducibly complex. I guess for a system, this
But
may this analysis may be a little easier. For
Mhm.
for a given system, imagine you have let's say you have three parts that are totally necessary for its function.
Okay.
Okay, so you have part one, part two, and part three, and if you lose any of those parts, the function is not completed.
Yep.
Okay, so let's say you start off, and like even in many times when you're building something, the first time you make something, it's very crude, right? You make like a crude design.
Yeah, I would say
Okay,
okay.
so let's say part one is the first crude design of, and it performs the function by itself, but it does not perform it well. Okay,
Okay.
so let's then say that over time, part two becomes, is in a symbiotic relationship with part one, and their advantage is that part one and part two combined perform the function better than
But
just part one.
but I think in that scenario, it's not irreducibly complex because you could take one away and it would still function crudely,
Right.
but it would
I'm
still
aware. We're getting there.
okay.
Okay. So now imagine you have part three come in through the same sort of symbiotic relationship,
Mhm.
and part one, two, and three performs the function better than just part one and part two. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
So you're basically saying they specialize over time.
Yeah,
Kind of.
for the most part. So in the initial part one, part two, part three, you're right. You could take away part two or part
And
three, and you would still have function. But over
yeah,
time, through mutation, they can become so integrated that you can't take those parts away. And if you do take the parts away, you do lose function. So
he
what I'm
was
saying,
yeah, he was. I mean, he brought that point up. Uh, but he was kind of saying if you have those types of mutations, but from like a natural selection viewpoint, though, it wouldn't really, I guess, enhance your well-being because the function's still getting done. So
no,
he
that's
was,
just, if he said that, that's absolutely false, because you can have something that completes the function with more efficient, less use of energy.
but I guess his argument was that the function is still getting done. Like it's like, oh, that thing's shiny, but ooh, that thing's even shinier. But they're not.
Right, but you still have a advantage, even if you're using less energy, that's still an advantage, because then you can use that excess energy to go do something else.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess from that, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, that's pretty much, if you're going to argue on, a genetic level, you have to, or a genotypic level, that is an argument. Just because the function is still being completed, if it can be done better, like when you write Excel programs, don't you prefer to have the best Excel program, right? The one that toggles through data the quickest, or
Yeah, I mean,
sorts.
you can make the actual code shorter, but at the end of the day, if it's still producing the same thing, it a lot of people don't care.
Well, I guess let me
Um,
put it in this term. If you were like to compile, I mean, compiling data, that takes a long time, right?
mhm,
Okay, so
sometimes,
would
yeah.
you rather have some type of program that can compile data in 2 hours or in 20 hours?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would rather have it done quicker, but I guess the thing is, but it's still, I don't really
So the point is
think,
that if you have an energy advantage, you will be able to reproduce more. So you will further your genetic material on more. So
mhm.
it's your DNA the enhanced DNA that will be spread out into the future, where it's the other DNA that will sort of be lost, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah. I mean, it all comes back to the fact he says no one can show how these cells could possibly like change like this.
Yeah, that's fair.
And that's
and sort of what my counter is, I don't think in many regards, I don't think it's possible. And I don't think anyone cares to do it.
I guess I'm surprised. Well, I mean, why don't we just analyze that going forward? Like, why don't they just keep track of all the mutations or try to in like
Well,
some.
they have like sort of what I was going back to talking about penicillin and the bacteria. So I mean, part of my problem with his book is he acknowledges microevolutions. So he had no problem acknowledging what I said, that.
So yeah, the natural selection part he agrees with. He just doesn't know that there are certain things that seem by design and certain things are by natural selection.
Yeah. Well, I guess so. So you want to, well, you brought up design. So you want to explain essentially what his argument is?
So he defines design as a purposeful arrangement of parts. I guess what I remember, he did bring up an example of, you're like crossing the street, you see like a car accident on the other side, there's a guy laying down, what you perceive as blood coming from the guy, so you rush over, you notice a cameraman on the opposite side of the street, and then when you get to the guy with all the blood, he kind of like turns over and smiles and explains, they're doing an experiment on the willingness of a passerby to help an injured person. And the point of that story was that this perceived accident was designed. And that if the fact that anything could have been designed is that we cannot know that something has not been designed. And he also brought up a kind of a funny story of like, you're playing Scrabble and, you're playing with some friends, you go to the kitchen, and then when you get back, all the pieces are, folded in the box or like turned over in the box, except there's one message that's saying, like, take us out to dinner, cheapskate. And then a person seeing that would detect design. I guess you got anything to add on, I guess, that part?
Yeah. So what I took away was that he was not advocating like traditional creationism that says like the earth is, I think, 10,000 years old and God, made all living organisms. Sort of what I was getting was that on top of evolutionary biology, he had a problem with, I think we can talk about these after, some of these early life experiments and how did we get living organisms from non-living organisms. And he was saying some of these cellular systems, it's not possible for them to evolve from a Darwinian point of view, and that some type of intelligent design must have sort of started off like bacteria with some of these systems. And some of the systems he's talking about are genes, I think genes for the eye, genes for like blood clotting. I think those were the two main ones.
I mean,
right?
the blood clotting really, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, he goes through how it works, and it is just incredibly complex. And the timing of things is just insane. Because, like, I mean, if your blood just started to clot, you would die. And then if you get a cut and it doesn't clot, then you're going to die too. So it's just all this sequence of protein. It's proteins, right, that are like working like.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, it's like these proteins that are interacting, and It's mind-boggling how complex it is and how many dependencies there are. And I mean, he goes through some. I don't really remember the super detailed version of the mathematics, but he was trying to say like it's hard to envision that this happened gradually.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, he did. I thought, like I said, I thought a lot of his criticisms of the field were fair, and I mean, I think he was sort of right. So some of these, the thing that I have no problem acknowledging is that like natural selection does. I don't think it does explain how life began.
Right.
So
And
the two main experiments were run by the Euler-Miller and then Joan Aurore. And really what they did was they mixed a bunch of gases together with water in the air and then sparked like an electrical current through it. And to be fair, Euler and Miller did at the time, I don't think they could detect them. They could detect all of them, but I went back and reread it, and some of the modern day experiments sort of reproducing what they did have detected all of the amino acids made in that circumstances. But he then made a valid point that a protein is made up of usually between 50 and I don't know, like a small end protein would probably be like 100 amino acids linked together. A big end protein would probably be like 1,000, maybe more. And no one has ever shown how amino acids could sort of spontaneously link together like that in just sort of that type of fashion. And if you actually think about that, and if you think that, so they're assuming that there's a lot of water in the area, and that actually makes a lot of sense that the amino acids wouldn't link together, because when you link amino acids together, you give off water. So if there's a lot of water present, there's like sort of, you set up like what's called an equilibrium. So if you have a lot of water, you're not going to want to do a chemical reaction that generates water. The equilibrium would be shifting towards sort of water leaving the system. So that is, I mean, he is right. That is no one showed that to my knowledge, and I think that's a fair criticism. And then the other one by Joan Aurore did essentially the same type of reaction except with nucleic acid. So she ran a similar type of experiment, and she found the nucleic acids.
Well, I forget, what is the difference between a nucleic acid and an amino acid? An amino acid.
Okay, so this sort of goes, so a nucleic acid, so like you have DNA, right?
Yep.
So DNA is deoxynucleic acids. You have RNA, so like ribonucleotide nucleic acids. So DNA and RNA, so the D is a sugar, and then the nucleic acid is its base. So like ACGT. Do you remember those?
Yeah, I do. But like, what are they? These are like molecules or
Yeah.
what? Okay.
So a nucleic acid those are what make up your DNA. So this sort of goes back to the dogma of biology. You have DNA that's made up of two complementary strands of you have a sugar backbone and then you have these bases that complement each other, and that's the nucleic acids. So, and then that is what's referred to, the DNA has to be opened up, and then these enzymes read it, and they do it's called transcribe. Like you can think of it as an enzyme is just writing down the sequence of the DNA, and you're transcribing that into what's called RNA. More specifically, it's referred to as mRNA, so like messenger. And then that is transported to an enzyme called the ribosome, And the ribosome then reads the mRNA, which is sort of a writing of the DNA. And then that does something that's called translating. So, and then it translates the mRNA into a protein. Does that make sense?
Okay.
And a protein is made up of amino acids. So each code, like you have a three RNA sequence from your DNA is then converted into a specific amino acid. And then it goes down the entire list of the mRNA, reading the, essentially, well, it's reading a written version of the DNA. So it knows what amino acids to link together. And part of the reason you need an enzyme is because it is unfavorable to link amino acids together. Because, like I said, in your cells, it's mainly a water environment and you're giving off water. So that would be unfavorable. So that's like the basic dogma of biology. Yeah, and those are fair criticisms, but just because, I guess just because no one has proven how they happened doesn't mean they didn't happen organically, I guess.
True, but I mean, he's kind of saying the status quo should be design and that you should have to prove it could happen, right? That's kind of where he's kind of coming from.
That's fine. Like it's fine if you believe that, but I guess what I would say is that, once you acknowledge that microevolutions happen, and this is the biggest problem I had with the book. Like once you acknowledge that microevolutions happen, I feel like you sort of have to acknowledge that macroevolutions would happen. I'm not really talking about the early life stuff. I think I sort of view that differently. But sort of like what he's talking about, the systems, the cellular systems. I'm saying, like, once you acknowledge that there are changes that do happen over time on a micro time level, I feel like I guess what I'm saying is, like, why would you then say that they can't happen on a macro level? And, right? Like,
well, I kind of agree with you, but he kind of brings up the time constraints and how, if you look at how many, who knows how he's getting some of these estimates, but
yeah,
the number of mutations you would need and how that progression would work, it doesn't seem like you'd have enough time. But I don't really, and I didn't really think too much of the math, but some of it, when he explained the blood clotting, I was kind of taken back on how complex it is. And to be honest, before I read this book, I thought all that stuff had been proven. I was operating like they knew how this happened. They knew how, like, these progressions happened at the cell level.
Yeah, sort of like I said, I don't think really anyone cares.
Yeah. Well, it kind of like if, it's definitely interesting, because then you start thinking, like, dude, are we like living like I know it's like, it might sound crazy, but like in the Matrix, or like, the Truman Show.
Yeah,
that's
fair.
Like where you're okay. So like all this is, if this is really by design, well, who's the designer? What are we doing?
I guess the way I don't think there was any way we could really get around this, but the way I sort of think about this is so when he says intelligent design, I think of like a god, right? That's what you think of. So I guess
but he made sure not to say that, right? He said
he doesn't.
it's like, okay, this is by design, but he's not really saying who the designer is or what designed it.
Well, the argument then just goes back and back. Like, even if it was, I think he had some scientist like quoted saying like he envisioned like aliens coming to Earth and like seeding bacteria or something.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember that part? I
The
guess,
very end, right? Yeah, I think.
right. So if you're gonna say that, you have to then just go back. Well, then like, how did the designers sort of come into existence?
Right,
And
yeah. Who designed the designer?
so I guess what I'm saying is, at some point, if you're, I just feel like you can't get around saying you believe in a God if you believe in intelligent design. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, believing in God. But I guess this is sort of the point I'm trying to make is, if you look at religions through history, what do you think I guess, what do you feel like the point of a religion is?
The point of a religion?
Yeah, what do you think the point of a religion is?
I guess I would say to bring people together for
Yeah,
a common belief,
right.
sense
Yeah,
of community.
yeah, I would agree. And I've read some studies that say, humans need to allow humans to work together on a like a higher order. They
Mhm.
need to have some type of common belief. Like, you need to believe in something that unifies you, right?
Mhm.
So I guess the next sort of point I would make is that throughout history, why don't we see polytheist religions really anymore?
Um, why don't we see polytheist religions anymore? I think probably just well, I don't really know the history. Was there a time where people started killing the polytheists? I'm not sure.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
mean,
know.
that's part of it, but like, the Egyptians believed in, I think, Ra, the sun god,
Okay.
right? The Greeks believed in Apollo, the sun god.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and to my knowledge, Apollo's function was to ride a chariot across the sky, pulling the sun.
Okay.
Okay, so, and the Norse people believed in, the whole Norse mythology. Like, Thor was the god of thunder, right?
So I guess as science has progressed, those have gone away.
That's
Is that where you're
that's
getting
sort of
at?
what I'm saying. Like, we can, that's what I'm getting at. Like, we can now say with a high degree of certainty that, the Earth spins on an axis, and that's why at times we see the sun and why we don't. And we know that, no one is in the sky pulling the sun across our horizon. We know how lightning is formed. We don't need to believe in, sort of the supernatural to make these natural phenomenon. And he actually sort of talks about this, and this is kind of just how I feel. I feel like even the point of science is just, sort of for the pursuit of truth. And I guess I agree with a ton of what Behe says, like, about his criticisms of the field, but I think it's sort of lazy to then just say there's an intelligent designer. Uh, and I guess my own personal opinion, I guess I didn't say this in his blog, is that he's a Roman Catholic, and I think he's obviously very religious, and I think he wants to believe in God, and there's
Well,
nothing wrong with that.
he brought up the point that over 90% of Americans believe in God, yet some of these scientists that are also religious somehow, I guess, don't address this design argument. What do you think of that? I guess it's because they're getting funding, right? I mean, their jobs depend on it in some ways.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, I read Lehigh essentially writes a disclaimer about Dr. Behe, saying like, we do not endorse his philosophy of intelligent design, which, you know, it is what it is. I mean, yeah, I sort of do agree with you. He actually had an interesting point. He had a let me see if I have the quote written down.
But just to be clear, like, I mean, he's not saying he doesn't believe in natural selection.
Yeah, he does. I think he does believe in that, and that's sort of
he believes in it. Yeah,
right.
he's just saying, yeah, there's certain parts that seem so good that they don't
They
seem like
can't.
they could be gradual, and they kind of scream design.
That is his argument. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, he had some really good quotes in here. Science is not a game, and scientists should follow the physical evidence wherever it leads, with no artificial restrictions. I thought that was good. Follow the data, remove own biases. I guess that was Einstein put in some type of Einstein was so against the Big Bang, I guess he put into his own formulas some type of what's the word?
That was like epsilon, like he was like an error term.
Yeah, some type of standardization factor.
Yeah, that was had to do with like the or like the universe like expanding or contracting, something like that.
Right. I guess the thing that I didn't know, he started talking about the Big Bang. I guess a lot of people were totally against the theory of the Big Bang. I guess they view that as sort of like an inception and as a reason of religion, or as a god, which is to me sort of interesting.
Dang. So we have more questions than answers after reading this book.
Yeah, it also turns out he wrote 2 more books that I think probably at some future date we should do. Hedge of Evolution came out in 2007, and then Darwin Devolves came out quite recently in 2019. I have a feeling that they're probably, a whole lot of the same, but you would get at least, through the years, the new science that's come out, and listen to him talk about how it doesn't prove anything.
I mean, I kind of like, I mean, he goes through, I mean, and I hear this a lot, like, or I think, especially since we're like Jewish, a lot of people, that when you watch those Holocaust interviews, many of them that, end up surviving like concentration camps, they often say they don't believe in God anymore. And he didn't talk about that specifically, but he talks about how a lot of people kind of point to the imperfections as evidence that there is no design. And like the kind of I guess the line of thinking would be like, if there is intelligent design, there'd be like no flaws. And like the agent, whoever is designing, wouldn't include the flaws. But he kind of, I thought this was a good way to think about things. This is just in general, like, but he kind of said, like, because something does not fit our idea of the way things ought to be, then, this is evidence against design. And it kind of just makes you question, like, well, who's to say, like, the designer, what their motive is, what they view as good, what they view as bad, what they're trying to accomplish, if there was a designer. I thought that was interesting. And it kind of gets back just like cultures. Like it's hard for Americans sometimes to understand what's good and bad in other, like, I mean, any other culture.
Yeah, that's very true. I don't know. You've been in Japan. Did you make any social faux pas in Japan?
I don't think so. Did you? I don't even know if anyone would have pointed it out because I can't speak Japanese, so I don't know.
I mean, we were well, we were in a very we were the only Americans in the area we were staying in. We were at like a Japanese exclusive tourist spot, and I got the feeling that they were not super happy that we were there. We didn't speak Japanese. Remember Dad and I like just sort of lounging about in like the shower area,
Uh-huh.
in the hot tub. We got some weird looks.
I do. Now that you say it, I do remember not taking my shoes off in one restaurant, and there was like an area to take your shoes off, and I did. Elena kind of reminded me as I started walking on the floor with my shoes still on that I needed to take them off. Yeah. So what else
I
you
guess
want
with
to
that
talk
said,
about? We didn't really talk about the there was that, I think it was Paley was the scientist that brought up like that like thought experiment, like, you know, if you're like walking and like you pass by like watch versus like just passing by a stone, like one, your initial reaction is, oh, you know, the watch is designed, whereas the, you know, the stone's probably just, you know, like been there forever, nothing special.
Yeah, that was an interesting point. The other interesting point was that the point he made was people often say nature designs. That sort of, he's like, well, that just sort of leads exactly into what I'm saying, is that there is a designer. And you know, he said that, and then I was thinking like sort of, I guess, how I thought about like sort of refuting some of his ideas. I was using the word design, and I'm like, okay, well, I don't know if I should necessarily be saying that. But yeah, and that was an interesting point, because I believe the exact opposite, just from, I guess, my schooling, is that, I guess my point is that if you acknowledge microevolution, then by definition you have to acknowledge, or not necessarily definition, but I feel like if you acknowledge it happening on a micro time scale, you have to acknowledge that it can happen on a macro time scale, and that since you've seen it on a micro time scale, the burden of proof should not be on the evolutionary biologists to map out all of the individual pathways of how to make these systems, but I think the burden of proof should be on him to prove that they're designed. And I guess what I'm saying is that saying that they currently haven't proven how they've evolved in a Darwinian fashion, I don't think is evidence to say that they were designed. On the same note, there probably.
Well, what do you think of the fact that like all these people are trying to do these experiments in a lab to show like the early life stuff, and no one can kind of replicate like a cell, like they can't figure out how to make a cell from, I guess, these atoms or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, that's fair. But you know, he sort of was making it sound like it's super easy to go into a lab and, you know, make amino acids and make nucleic acids as a chemist. I mean, it's not terribly difficult, but it's not terribly easy either. The fact that you can just mix gases together and then put a spark in them, and the fact that you get them, does show something. It shows that it is likely that they were around, I mean, on a early Earth atmosphere. So, I mean, who knows? I mean, yeah, I don't have an answer of how DNA then formed. I don't have an answer of how proteins formed. But I don't think that, I guess what I'm saying is, I don't think that just because I can't say how it happened, I'm not going to acknowledge that something put it there. I think even if I do believe, even if my own beliefs of God, I think you should look to, try and figure out how it happened, not just sort of throw your hands up in the air, say it's too complex, it's not possible. There must be some type of intelligent designer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess we could just go in the middle and say we don't know. you just like we need more evidence to go one way or the other, maybe.
Yeah, that's fine. But even I guess what I'm saying is, even if you, and sort of what he alluded to in the book is that a lot of these scientists would say is that even if you do believe in God, I still think you should try and figure out how it it could have happened organically, like to search out how it could have happened or what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just my own personal belief.
Yeah, this book like messed with my mind. I don't know what to think anymore. It's yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, what were your main takeaways?
My main takeaways are that anything I assume I should, and I mean, this goes back to, I mean, a lot of people, Ray Dalio always mentions this, but like, instead of thinking you know something, think, how do I know something? And I think this book just reinforced that message, because I thought it was like slam dunk, obvious, totally, and I actually thought it had been proven. But like I thought they had already, and I just didn't remember what I actually learned in school. Like I thought some of this stuff at the cellular level had kind of been shown, or yeah, at least accepted that this was kind of the way it was. And now I'm kind of looking at some of these things differently. So yeah, I guess always question your assumptions, and it's often the things that the things you're like so sure of that just aren't so, that get you in trouble. So yeah, question your assumptions is what I will take away from this.
I was pretty much the same. Question everything. I mean, I guess we were probably going to end with this. I still believe in evolution. I think, like I said, I think his criticisms of the fields were fair. And yeah, some of that, some of those early life experiments are pretty interesting. And I honestly, I don't think there will ever be a definitive answer. So it just sort of comes back to, I think, what do you personally believe in, and I think that's totally okay.
I'm at this point, I am just like middle of the fence. Like, I mean, a lot of his stuff was pretty compelling. And the timeline stuff with how many mutations you would need, and kind of just thinking through that stuff. And I'm kind of like, I mean, I guess before we read this, I still always question, like, okay, how do you explain that first bit of matter, even if you think, yeah, the Big Bang type of scenario happened? How do you explain that first set of matter? Like, it doesn't just happen. It doesn't like yeah. So
Yeah, I mean, that's a tenet. That is a royal commandment of physics. Like, matter cannot be created or destroyed, only transferred.
Yeah. So are we are we like ants in like a ant container, and some weird designer is playing with everyone on Earth? I don't know, watching over us. I'm not sure.
So I guess, do you currently believe in evolution?
So just to make sure, evolution, like meaning like things were generated from inorganic material, like those early life experiments, you mean? Like,
Yeah,
do
we
I
can let,
think cells came
well,
from that
let's
type
start with
of?
that. Sure, let's start with that.
I don't. I like I said, I don't know. I'm unsure. I do believe in natural selection.
Okay.
I do believe in that. But I'm legitimately questioning, are certain things designed? And yeah, were certain systems designed? That is the part I am legitimately questioning now. I don't
Okay.
know.
I guess the last thing I would say is that you know, also the field is not very old.
Mhm.
And actually, he had a great quote, which I think sort of earmarked how I thought about a lot of this. Uh, when a question is too difficult for science to deal with immediately, it is happily forgotten why other more accessible questions are dealt with. And that is kind of how I sort of feel with this. I don't think the field can currently really answer these questions. So, you know, for the time being, if you know, anyone can believe whatever they want to believe in.
Mhm. Yeah, because I mean,
I still believe in evolution.
it's gonna be hard to get someone to fund some sort of research
Right.
on this type
Yeah.
of thing.
It's not. I think
It's
at the level at the. I also kind of think he sort of does a. I'm blanking on the word, but I think at the level that he would want the data, I think it's almost probably impossible. I think it would be impossible to prove to him
uh-huh.
something else. Like I
Okay.
don't think you could show him enough data and evidence that he would be like, yes, I totally believe in evolution.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't mean to speak for Dr. Behe, but that was the gist that I got from
Mhm.
uh, just reading about him and reading this book. Uh, so
Maybe
yeah,
he'll join us on the next one.
yeah, maybe we should do. Maybe at some point we should do. I guess we could probably. I don't know if we would really need to do the 2007 book, but we could do his newest book and maybe invite him on.
Well, sorry, what
Uh,
was the newest one again?
the newest one was Darwin Devolves. I have it pulled. Let me see. I think I have it pulled up. Yeah, Darwin Devolves.
Okay.
Central premise is that a combination of random mutation and natural selection, apart from being incapable of generating nobility, is mainly a degradative force. Huh.
Hmm.
That's sort of okay. I'm sort of intrigued now. Uh, so interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, you got anything else, Jack? Or are you
Mm,
about good?
I think I'm good.
All right. Well, I guess with that said, please reach out to us at brothersonbooks@gmail.com for any book recommendations, or if you would like to be a guest host for a particular book you have in mind. A great review or rating on whichever platform you're listening to. This would be greatly appreciated. And lastly, if you can think of any friend, family member, or coworker that might like this episode, please pass it along. Yet again, I am Alex Allweil. With me, as always, is Jack Allweil. And Jack, what book are we doing next?
So we are going to be doing a book by the name of Man's Search for Meaning, which is about I think he actually grew up in Vienna.
You did, yeah.
But he was
Victor Frankl.
yeah, survivor from the Holocaust. So it will be a kind of different type of discussion, but I think very enlightening and put some perspective on some things. So, yeah.
Well, I think this has been a good convo.
Yeah.
I think this has been a good episode.
I still feel like my mind has been warped, and I don't like the feeling.
That's fair. It's one of those things that, like, belief is just, belief because it's what you believe. So sometimes you just got to go with it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't really tend to think about a lot of this stuff really ever. So it was definitely interesting reading this book and, really, question some of my own beliefs and, made me think a lot.
Yeah, it's definitely a book I would have never read on my own had you not picked it. So thank you for that. And I guess we will see you next time.
All righty. See you, Jay.
Okay.